Despite being the most iconic female character in one of the most iconic comic book franchises of all time, Spider-Man's Mary Jane Watson isn't really counted among the most notable female comic book characters. For over 50 years since she was first introduced, she's mostly been portrayed as an object of desire for Spider-Man to save, rather than a driving force in the plot in her own right. Insomniac Games' Marvel's Spider-Man for the PS4 and PS5, however, lets Mary Jane be a hero in her own right. In between missions of playing as Spider-Man, the player occasionally controls Mary Jane for missions where she solves puzzles and sneaks past bad guys to gather clues that advance the plot. Many have criticized the Mary Jane missions for slowing down the pace of the game, but these missions are important. The strength of Mary Jane's representation is not only due to how she's portrayed in the story, but also how the game's mechanics reinforce her representation through the player's actions while they control her in her missions. As Charles Pullman Moore writes, Mary Jane was more or less defined by her attractiveness. Mary Jane has constantly been objectified in the comics, not just in the way the comics frame her visually, but through her jobs. Whether it's waitressing, disco dancing, modeling, or acting, her jobs are characterized by serving others or being watched. As Pullman Moore writes, Mary Jane was only there as a desirable object for Spider-Man to fight over with other villains, while not having many adventures herself. Mary Jane's few solo endeavors and tragic family life are overshadowed by the constant times she's been stalked, attacked, or kidnapped. Insomniac Games writer Ben Arfman told Sci-Fi Wire that one of the themes that the writing team wanted to include in Marvel's Spider-Man was the theme of partnership and how important it was for Parker to not just rely on himself to solve problems. Mary Jane's character was reworked to better fit this theme. He explained that none of her previous occupations in the comics really lent themselves to being an active part of the story. They decided to make her an investigative reporter for the Daily Bugle because that would let her contribute to Pete's work on an equal footing. The MJ of Marvel's Spider-Man immediately subverts and reverses the dynamic of damsel in distress that has come to define her in the comics. In one of the early missions, Spider-Man investigates an auction house selling off the belongings of Kingpin. After sneaking into a storage room, he is cornered by a member of the Inner Demons gang. As the tension starts to rise along with the music, Mary Jane strikes the gang member. But even after displaying her agency and competence in sneaking through enemy territory, Spider-Man worries about MJ's safety. When MJ proposes to team up with Spider-Man, he asks if Mary Jane wants to be a sidekick or a Spider-Girl, before she emphasizes that she wants to be a partner. This shows that the webhead, while clearly respecting MJ, doesn't quite recognize her independence yet and doesn't completely view her as an equal. After Spider-Man botches a chance for MJ to get info on the bad guys, MJ tells Spider-Man that the reason they broke up was because of how overprotective he was. Next time we control MJ, she has to work with Spider-Man to save everybody in the train station. As she sneaks around the guards, she, through the player, can decide to have Spider-Man take out a gang member. While working with Spider-Man, she has full control of the situation. This really kicks off the process of Spider-Man learning to work with MJ, and it culminates in the final mission with MJ, where Spider-Man finally lets her go so she could sneak into Mayor Osborn's penthouse to expose his secrets. Mary Jane's agency is not just emphasized by the game's story and narrative, but by the gameplay itself. You go from the action-adventure gameplay of Spider-Man to stealth gameplay for Mary Jane's missions. You move around an area without crossing the line of sight of enemies while occasionally distracting them to sneak past. You can't knock out enemies like you can as Spider-Man, at least not until you get the stun gun in the final mission, and getting caught makes you instantly fail the mission. The conventions of tension and vulnerability, along with gameplay that focuses on outsmarting rather than overpowering enemies inherent to stealth action games, signals to the player of Mary Jane's bravery, determination, and wits. In addition to stealth, you also encounter puzzles. Puzzle solving further reinforces Mary Jane's inquisitiveness and wit to the player. The signaling of her as an intuitive character is further enhanced by the contrast between her gameplay and Spider-Man's. While Spider-Man emphasizes reflexes and timing as he swings through New York and beats up bad guys, MJ's gameplay requires more patience to get through. However, Mary Jane is still positioned as a secondary character in the game, which runs a little counter to her agency. She doesn't get to fight any of the villains with Spider-Man, and she's only involved in 5 of the game's 36 missions. Now, this is a Spider-Man game, but it's still concerning, as female characters mostly fill secondary roles in video games. Another reason I'm hesitant to put MJ's representation on a pedestal is Insomniac Games itself. Former Insomniac Games technical director Sol Brennan accused developers in the company of harassing and abusing women in the double digits. The developers have said that they were taking steps to address the allegations, however. But Mary Jane doesn't need to punch villains to be a hero. With her investigative reporting and assistance to Spider-Man, driving the plot and helping to save the day, she becomes a hero in her own way. It's all thanks to how the game represents her as a character with agency, both through the story and the gameplay mechanics. I've seen tons of hissy fits on Reddit and Twitter over female characters in games, and I've noticed that many of the controversies revolve mostly around playable female characters. This project made me realize just how important it is to have underrepresented people in playable roles. Despite being under the control of the player, playable characters have a lot of power and influence on how people experience a game. The MJ missions provide a lot more nuance to Marvel's Spider-Man. Despite what others might think, I believe the game would have been poorer without these missions. With Mary Jane moving from a trophy to be fought over to an independent character with much higher stakes in the story, she helps make video gaming a more inclusive space for future female characters and maybe even female players. If that's not heroic, I don't know what is.